They called it charity, a merciful arrangement for widows who had nowhere else to go. But Mary Ellen Pike would learn that mercy, when managed by the right people, could be measured, scheduled, and quietly collected. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now let's continue with the story. Mary Ellen Pike did not consider herself unlucky. That belief was the first thing she clung to after the mine took her husband. The men who brought the news spoke gently, hats in hand, voices lowered, as if sound itself could disturb grief. They told her the collapse was quick, that he felt nothing, that God had called him home without warning. None of those words paid the debts he left behind. Within weeks, the land she and her husband rented was reclaimed. Tools were counted, furniture was assessed. What could not be carried was recorded, and what could not be recorded was forgotten. By early autumn, Mary Ellen stood with 2 dresses, a pair of worn shoes, and the understanding that widowhood came with an expiration date. That was when the offers arrived. They did not come all at once. That would have felt suspicious. Instead, they arrived in sequence, each one delivered with a sympathetic smile and a nearly identical tone. The first came from the Holcomb estate, a request for housekeeping help while their eldest daughter recovered from illness. The second came from the Barlow farm, framed as short-term assistance during harvest. The third came from the Lowry place, presented by the local preacher himself, who described it as a blessing arranged through prayer. None of them mentioned contracts. None of them spoke of wages clearly. Each spoke of provision, shelter, and moral respectability, the 3 things a widow was told she must protect at all costs. What made the arrangement seem reasonable was its balance. She would not belong to any single household. She would rotate, 2 months at a time, then move on. The preacher called it community cooperation. He said it prevented burdening one family too heavily, and it ensured Mary Ellen would always have somewhere to go. Mary Ellen noticed the details others did not think to explain. The dates were already chosen. Her arrival days aligned neatly across the 3 estates, as if discussed long before she agreed. When she asked how long the work would last, the answer came quickly and without calculation. 6 years. It sounded long, but long was better than endless. Her first night at the Holcomb estate passed quietly. She slept in a narrow room near the kitchen, rose before dawn, and worked until her hands stiffened. No one was unkind. That unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Kindness made obligation harder to refuse. At church the following Sunday, the preacher spoke of widows who carried the community through difficult seasons. He did not name her, but several heads turned in her direction. After the service, women pressed her hands and thanked her for her strength, for her willingness to serve, for accepting God's calling without complaint. Mary Ellen had not known she had accepted anything beyond employment. As the weeks passed, the rotation began to feel less like work and more like placement. Her movements were anticipated, her meals were planned. Even her rest days were suggested rather than chosen. When she prepared to leave the Holcomb estate, a wagon was already waiting. At the Barlow farm, she found the same room arrangement, the same expectations, and the same quiet approval. At the Lowry place, the preacher visited often, checking on her health with a seriousness that felt administrative rather than pastoral. By the end of the first month, Mary Ellen realized something that unsettled her deeply. She had not been asked what she wanted, not once. Everyone spoke as if her agreement had been given long ago, somewhere she could not remember. Still, she told herself this was survival. Survival did not require understanding. It required endurance. And endurance, she believed, was something she still possessed. By the time Mary Ellen Pike reached the end of her first month, the novelty of movement had worn thin. What remained was rhythm, precise and unyielding. The wagon arrived on the same morning each time, just after dawn, its wheels crunching gravel in a way that seemed deliberate. There was never a question of readiness. Her trunk was expected to be packed, her apron folded, her place in the house already erased before she left it. At the Holcomb estate, they praised her quiet efficiency. At the Barlow farm, they admired her stamina. At the Lowry place, they spoke of her moral character, often in her presence, as if reinforcing a shared understanding. Each household believed it knew her, yet none asked her anything that mattered. The work itself was not unusual. Cooking, cleaning, laundering, tending to small domestic tasks that kept large properties running smoothly. What unsettled her was how similar each place felt once the day settled into motion. The same instructions delivered in different voices, the same expectations dressed in different manners. At each estate she was given a small room near the kitchen, narrow bed, wash basin, a single hook for her dress. No personal items were encouraged. When she asked once, carefully, whether she might leave a Bible on the table, the woman of the house smiled and said it would be safer kept with her belongings, so nothing was misplaced. Sunday services became the anchor of her weeks. No matter which estate she occupied, she was expected at the same church, seated in the same pew reserved for widows and unmarried women. The preacher spoke often of order, of God's design for communities that worked together rather than apart. He never mentioned her name. He did not need to. After services, men approached her less often than women did. The women asked about her health, her sleep, whether she was eating enough. Their concern felt practiced, as though taught. When she mentioned fatigue, the response was always reassurance. Adjustment takes time. A willing spirit will be rewarded. Mary Ellen began to notice how her schedule aligned with the lives around her. Her heaviest workdays coincided with gatherings she was not invited to attend. When visitors arrived at the estates, she was redirected to back rooms or sent on errands that kept her out of sight. She was present, but never visible. At the Barlow farm, she overheard a conversation between two men discussing the coming year. They spoke of stability, of avoiding outside trouble, of keeping matters within the valley. When she entered the room, the conversation ended without explanation. No one raised a hand to her. No one threatened her outright. That, she realized, was the most disorienting part. Everything was framed as care, as foresight, as protection. When she reached the Lowry place for the second time, the preacher visited in the evening. He asked about her health with clinical interest, his eyes scanning her posture, her complexion. He advised more rest and insisted she drink a tonic prepared by the midwife, meant to strengthen women burdened by work. She drank it because refusal would have required explanation. Each transition between estates left her more tired than the last. The work did not increase, but the expectation did. She was praised when she complied quickly, corrected gently when she hesitated. The word obligation was never spoken, yet it hung over every interaction. Late one night, unable to sleep, Mary Ellen counted the days she had spent at each place. The pattern was exact. 2 months, then move on. No variation. No allowance for illness beyond minor adjustments that never changed the final schedule. She wondered who kept the calendar. When she tried to imagine leaving, the thought stalled halfway through. Where would she go? The land she knew was no longer hers. The church had already positioned her as an example. Refusing now would not look like independence. It would look like ingratitude. Gratitude, she was learning, could be enforced without chains. By the end of the second month, Mary Ellen no longer asked when the wagon would come. She listened for it instead, the sound marking time more reliably than any clock. And with each rotation, she felt less like a worker passing through homes, and more like something being circulated, carefully, purposefully, and without her consent ever needing to be spoken aloud. The change did not announce itself all at once. It arrived quietly, the way weather shifts without thunder. Mary Ellen noticed it first in the mornings, a heaviness in her limbs that sleep did not relieve. The tonic the preacher had insisted upon now appeared more regularly, delivered with reminders that strong women required proper care. When her appetite shifted and her nausea lingered past a few days, the midwife was summoned without Mary Ellen asking. The confirmation was delivered gently, almost with relief. The midwife smiled and placed a hand on Mary Ellen's shoulder, speaking of blessings and purpose. She said the body often knew what it was meant to do, long before the mind accepted it. Word traveled faster than Mary Ellen expected. By the next rotation, every household seemed prepared. At the Holcomb estate, her workload was adjusted without discussion. At the Barlow farm, her meals were altered and monitored. At the Lowry place, the preacher offered prayers not for her comfort, but for successful outcomes, as if something beyond her health was being measured. No one asked how she felt about it. Mary Ellen tried to recall a moment of agreement, a conversation where this future had been discussed plainly. There was none. When she voiced uncertainty, she was met with reassurance that sounded rehearsed. The community would support her. She would not be alone. Everything had been arranged. That phrase returned often. Already arranged. As the months passed, the care surrounding her felt less like concern and more like supervision. Her movements were noted, her rest periods scheduled. The midwife kept records in a small leather book, writing without explanation. When Mary Ellen asked what was being recorded, she was told it was standard practice, for everyone's peace of mind. The birth itself passed without spectacle. It was managed quietly, efficiently, in a room Mary Ellen did not recognize as her own. She was allowed rest afterward, but not reflection. Decisions moved ahead of her, swift and certain. When she asked where the child would stay, the answer came calmly. The Holcomb estate would assume responsibility. They had the space, the resources, the obligation. Mary Ellen was told this was a kindness. One household taking the full burden so she could recover and continue her work without interruption. She was told the arrangement had been agreed upon in advance. She asked to see the agreement. What she was shown was not a contract but a ledger entry. Her name, the date written out in full, a note indicating support allocation. At the bottom, a signature that resembled hers closely enough to cause confusion. She did not remember signing it. The preacher explained that these matters were often handled during times of stress, when memory could falter. He reminded her that trust was essential for a community to function. Questioning generosity, he said gently, could strain relationships that had been built on faith. Mary Ellen did not argue. Arguing required certainty, and certainty was being worn away. She was allowed to see the child briefly, in the presence of others. The moment was framed as closure rather than beginning. She was thanked for her strength, for her contribution, for understanding what was necessary. When she returned to work, the rotation resumed as if nothing had changed. 2 months at a time. The same rooms, the same expectations, the same sermons praising sacrifice. What changed was how people looked at her. There was approval now, a sense of confirmation, as if she had fulfilled an unspoken requirement. Women nodded to her with new respect. Men spoke around her rather than to her. The preacher used her as an example in sermons about obedience and endurance, careful never to reveal specifics. Mary Ellen noticed that her name appeared more often in records she did not control. Church notes, midwife logs, household accounts. Each entry framed her role as complete, resolved, settled. Yet inside her, something remained unresolved. She realized that the rotation had not paused for her recovery because it was never meant to. The system had absorbed her pregnancy without disruption. The schedule held. That was when understanding began to form, slow and unwelcome. This was not an accident. It was not misfortune, it was a function. And she suspected it would not happen only once. Mary Ellen tried to return to routine, believing repetition might dull the questions forming in her mind. The work was familiar, the rotation unchanged. Yet something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer simply moving through households. She was being referenced. Her name surfaced in conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. The preacher mentioned her perseverance more often, pairing it with scripture about service and divine order. At each estate, she noticed papers being folded and set aside when she approached, as if her presence required discretion. It was at the Lowry place that she finally asked directly. She chose her words carefully, framing her concern as confusion rather than protest. She said she did not recall agreeing to permanent arrangements regarding the child. She asked if there had been a misunderstanding. The woman of the house did not appear offended. She reached into a drawer and removed a thin stack of documents tied with twine. These were not contracts in the formal sense. They were church records, assistance notes, and household acknowledgments. Each page carried Mary Ellen's name. Each was dated in full, written clearly and confidently. Several bore her signature. At first glance it looked right. The slant, the spacing, the shape of the letters. Only after several moments did she realize what troubled her. The pressure was consistent across every document, as if written in the same moment, with the same pen, under the same calm conditions. She had never signed anything calmly in the months after her husband died. When she said this aloud, the response came gently. The woman suggested grief altered memory. The preacher, called in shortly after, agreed. He spoke of how the mind protected itself by releasing burdens it could not carry. He said the body often remembered what the mind forgot. Mary Ellen asked if she could keep copies of the papers. The answer was no, but not because they were secret. She was told they were church property, records of stewardship, not meant for personal keeping. The language was always careful. Nothing was denied outright. Everything was reframed as procedure. As weeks passed, Mary Ellen noticed the records extended beyond what she had been shown. The midwife's leather book grew thicker. Church ledgers contained coded phrases she could not decipher. At the Barlow farm, she glimpsed a ledger where her name appeared beside columns she was not allowed to read. When she asked about those, she was told they tracked resource distribution, food, housing, labor. Her name, she realized, had become a category. The preacher's visits increased. He checked on her health with growing regularity, advising rest when she appeared tired, urging discipline when she hesitated. His concern was persistent, not warm. He spoke as if monitoring progress rather than offering comfort. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mary Ellen overheard him speaking with an estate manager. They discussed maintaining balance, avoiding strain, ensuring the valley remained self-sufficient. They spoke of her without using her name. That night, Mary Ellen lay awake replaying every conversation she could remember since the mine collapse. She searched for moments where she might have agreed to more than employment. There were none that felt clear. Yet the records existed, the ink was dry, the dates precise. Paper, she was learning, carried more authority than memory. When she next attended church, she sat through a sermon on submission and order, words delivered with practiced calm. The preacher spoke of individuals who resisted their calling, who confused discomfort with injustice. He warned that such confusion bred chaos. Mary Ellen felt eyes shift toward her, not accusing but expectant. After the service, women thanked her again for her strength. One whispered that not everyone was chosen for meaningful burdens. Mary Ellen did not know how to respond. The most unsettling realization came quietly. No one believed they were harming her. Every person involved saw themselves as responsible, faithful, and necessary. The system was not fueled by cruelty. It was sustained by certainty. Certainty, written in ink, sealed with prayer, and protected by community agreement. Mary Ellen understood then that resistance would not be met with force. It would be met with records, with scripture, with reminders of all that had been done for her, and she suspected the ink had not finished writing her future. Mary Ellen no longer measured time by seasons. She measured it by waiting. There was a period after the first child was claimed when the household seemed almost satisfied. The rotation continued, but the scrutiny softened. The preacher's visits became less frequent. The midwife's ledger remained present, yet her questions grew fewer. It felt, briefly, as though the system had taken what it needed and moved on. That illusion did not last. The signs returned slowly, familiar enough that Mary Ellen recognized them before anyone else did. The same heaviness in the mornings. The same careful adjustments to her meals. The same quiet consultations held just out of her hearing. No one announced anything. They never had to. What unsettled her most was not the realization itself, but the absence of surprise around her. When the midwife confirmed what Mary Ellen already suspected, there was no reaction of concern or hesitation, only acknowledgement. At the Barlow farm, the woman of the house nodded as if a scheduled task had arrived on time. At the Holcomb estate, work assignments were revised without explanation. At the Lowry place, the preacher resumed his evening visits, speaking again of endurance and calling. Mary Ellen began to watch more closely. She noticed that each estate responded differently, but in a way that fit together too neatly. The Barlows focused on preparation. The Holcombs discussed arrangements. The Lowry household framed everything through prayer and reassurance. Each played a role, distinct but coordinated. When the second child was born, there was no confusion about where responsibility would fall. This time, the Barlow farm assumed care. The explanation mirrored the first: capacity, fairness, balance. Mary Ellen was shown another ledger entry, another date written in full, another signature she did not remember placing. She did not ask to see the papers this time. She already understood how that conversation would end. What troubled her deeply was what followed. Within months, the same signs began again. By the third time, the pattern could no longer be dismissed as circumstance. Each pregnancy aligned with the rotation in a way that maximized labor continuity. Each recovery period ended precisely when another estate required her presence. Each child was assigned to a different household, completing a quiet distribution she had never agreed to but could now predict. She started counting, not days but decisions made without her. Meals adjusted, tonics delivered, sermons timed, conversations cut short when she entered rooms. The realization settled in slowly, like something sinking beneath water. This was not response. It was planning. Mary Ellen tested the edges of the system in small ways. She delayed drinking the tonic. The midwife noticed within hours. She lingered at church instead of returning promptly to work. A wagon was sent to retrieve her. She asked for rest beyond what was offered. The preacher reminded her that purpose required discipline. Nothing she did caused alarm. That was the most frightening part. The system absorbed her hesitation the same way it absorbed everything else, calmly and without deviation. During a rare quiet evening at the Holcomb estate, she overheard two women discussing provisions. One mentioned that the arrangement had proven reliable. The other replied that consistency was what mattered most in isolated valleys like theirs. Neither realized Mary Ellen could hear them. Reliable, consistent, words used for tools, for harvest cycles, for supply routes, not for people. Mary Ellen began to understand that each estate was not acting alone. They were components of something larger, something designed to sustain itself quietly, without drawing attention or requiring outside assistance. Children were raised into labor. Women like her were rotated until they could no longer serve, then replaced. She wondered how many had come before her, how many had passed through the same rooms, followed the same schedule, left behind children who never knew where they came from. The most chilling thought arrived without warning. If this had been planned so carefully, then her arrival had not been coincidence. Her widowhood had not been merely unfortunate timing. She had fit a need. By the time the third child was assigned, Mary Ellen no longer asked why. The question that occupied her thoughts instead was simpler and far more dangerous. How many times did they expect this to happen? And how long would they allow her to endure before deciding she had given enough? Mary Ellen's understanding of the valley changed the day she realized she was not alone. Until then, isolation had been one of the system's most effective tools. She was always surrounded by people, yet never allowed closeness. Conversations remained polite. Confessions never lingered. Everyone kept their burdens arranged neatly, like items placed on a shelf and never disturbed. That began to crack during a church gathering meant to honor widows and unmarried women who contributed to the community's stability. The event was framed as gratitude. Long tables were set. Food was served in careful portions. The preacher spoke at length about sacrifice, about unseen labor that sustained families through difficult years. Mary Ellen listened, her attention drifting from the words to the faces around her. She noticed patterns she had not allowed herself to see before. Several women seated nearby carried the same weariness she felt. Not exhaustion alone, but something deeper, a kind of restraint that went beyond manners. When they smiled, it arrived late and left early. When the preacher praised them, they lowered their eyes in unison, as if trained. Mary Ellen found herself seated beside a woman named Ruth, a widow from a neighboring ridge. They exchanged only brief pleasantries at first. Weather, work, the difficulty of keeping one's strength. The conversation felt ordinary, until Ruth mentioned the rotation. She did not use the word directly. She spoke around it, asking which household Mary Ellen was assigned to that month. When Mary Ellen answered, Ruth nodded once, confirming something to herself. Later, as dishes were cleared and conversations loosened, Ruth leaned closer. She asked, quietly, if Mary Ellen ever felt as though her life had been divided into segments she had not chosen. The question landed with unexpected force. Mary Ellen hesitated, then answered carefully. She said she often felt guided more than directed. That decisions seemed to precede her involvement. Ruth's expression did not change, but her shoulders eased, as though tension had been released. They did not speak again that evening. That alone was telling. Over the following weeks, Mary Ellen began to notice Ruth at each gathering, always present, always placed among the same group of women. There was also Clara, whose hands shook when she rested them in her lap, and Miriam, who avoided direct conversation, but watched everything with sharp attention. None of them spoke openly. They did not need to. Recognition passed between them in glances and unfinished sentences. When Mary Ellen mentioned fatigue, heads nodded. When she spoke of confusion over records, silence fell, heavy and confirming. One afternoon, during a rare overlap between rotations, Mary Ellen found herself walking beside Ruth along a narrow path near the church. The moment felt unplanned, but neither turned away. Ruth spoke first. She said she had lost her husband to illness and accepted work much the same way Mary Ellen had. Rotating households, promises of stability, emphasis on service. She said the first time had felt like misfortune. The second time felt like obligation. By the third, she realized it was expectation. Mary Ellen listened without interrupting. Ruth did not describe details. She did not need to. The structure was already familiar. What struck Mary Ellen most was the duration. Ruth had been rotating for nearly a decade. When Mary Ellen asked why she had not left, Ruth did not answer immediately. She gestured toward the valley, toward the farms and the narrow roads that led nowhere else. She said leaving would require resources she did not have, and permission no one would grant. She added something else, softer. Leaving would mean abandoning children she had carried but never raised, children she might still glimpse working fields or running errands for households that claimed them. Mary Ellen felt the weight of that truth settle heavily. Over time, fragments of other stories emerged. Clara spoke of records she had never signed. Miriam mentioned sermons delivered at precise moments, always following changes in her condition. Another woman, older and quieter, revealed she had been deemed no longer useful once her health declined. She had been reassigned to lesser work, quietly removed from the rotation. The system did not discard women harshly. It retired them. What united these women was not only experience, but silence. Each had learned, separately, that asking too many questions resulted in subtle consequences: reduced support, questioned character, withdrawal of church approval. None of it required force. Mary Ellen began to understand why the system endured. It relied on isolation to prevent patterns from forming. Women moved between households and obligations in ways that kept them from comparing experiences. Church gatherings were one of the few moments where paths crossed. Even then, conversation was monitored. The preacher often hovered nearby, his presence casual but persistent. He praised unity while maintaining distance between those who might disrupt it. One evening, as Mary Ellen prepared to leave the church grounds, Ruth pressed a small folded paper into her hand. She did not explain. She only said to be careful. Later, alone in her room, Mary Ellen unfolded it. Inside were names, dates written out in full, rotations marked with simple symbols. It was not an official record. It was a reconstruction, pieced together from memory and observation. Mary Ellen saw her own name listed among others. Seeing it there, alongside women she now recognized, shifted something inside her. Her experience was no longer singular. It was part of a pattern sustained by repetition and silence. The knowledge did not bring comfort. It brought clarity. She realized then that the system did not depend on secrecy alone. It depended on women believing their suffering was personal rather than structural. That misfortune, rather than design, governed their lives. Now that belief had fractured. Mary Ellen did not speak of rebellion. None of them did. The cost was too high. Instead, a quieter form of resistance began to form. Observation, memory, sharing fragments without drawing attention. They learned to communicate without words, to warn without accusations, to confirm without evidence. For the first time since her husband's death, Mary Ellen felt something other than confusion or endurance. She felt alignment. The danger of that realization settled in immediately. If the system depended on isolation, then connection was its greatest threat. And Mary Ellen knew, with sudden certainty, that once a pattern was seen, it could not be unseen. Mary Ellen did not set out to uncover anything. Discovery, she had learned, was rarely an act of courage. It was usually the result of proximity. The opportunity came during a week when schedules overlapped in an unusual way. A delayed wagon, a household preparing for visitors, a miscommunication that left her briefly unassigned for an afternoon. Time, unaccounted for, was dangerous in a place built on control. She spent that afternoon at the Lowry place, tasked with organizing a storage room rarely used. It was not forbidden work. It was simply work no one paid attention to. The room held boxes of records, bundled by year and purpose, church donations, household inventories, labor assignments, nothing labeled in a way that suggested secrecy. That was the first thing Mary Ellen noticed. The system did not hide itself. It assumed no one would question it. She worked slowly, careful not to disturb the order too much. Then she noticed a stack separated from the rest, thinner, newer, tied with twine of a different color. The handwriting on the top sheet was familiar. Not her signature, but the preacher's. The documents were not contracts. They were projections. Planning notes written in full sentences, with names reduced to initials. Columns marked availability, recovery, reassignment. One phrase appeared repeatedly, written with calm consistency. Replacement stability. Mary Ellen read the words several times before understanding what they implied. These were not records of what had happened. They were outlines of what was expected to happen. They charted labor needs across the 3 estates, matching them with births, rotations, and eventual reassignment of women deemed no longer viable. She searched for her initials. They appeared more than once. Beside them were notations indicating estimated capacity, optimal intervals, and a word she had never seen associated with a person before: yield. Her breath slowed as she continued reading. The language remained careful, professional, framed as stewardship rather than exploitation. Children were referenced only as future hands, never as sons or daughters. Women were evaluated based on endurance, compliance, and community standing. Nowhere was consent mentioned. The sound of footsteps in the hall brought her back sharply. She replaced the papers exactly as she had found them and returned to her task, heart steady but mind racing. That evening she said nothing. Mary Ellen had learned that immediate reaction only tightened the system's grip. Instead, she observed. She noticed how sermons aligned with planning cycles, how praise intensified before transitions, how women nearing the end of their usefulness were slowly repositioned, praised for years of service before being eased into invisibility. She watched the preacher more closely now. His concern for health was not pastoral, it was evaluative. He noticed posture, fatigue, compliance. His questions were diagnostic. One night, while passing near the study, Mary Ellen overheard a conversation she was not meant to hear. Two estate managers were present, speaking in measured tones. They discussed the difficulty of importing outside labor, the cost, the attention it brought. One of them said quietly that internal continuity had proven far more reliable. The other replied that the system worked because it appeared natural, community-based, God-sanctioned. They spoke of numbers, not children, not women, numbers. Mary Ellen heard one of them say that the current balance would hold if quotas were maintained, that disruptions occurred only when sentiment interfered with planning. She realized then that what she had endured was not abuse in the way stories often described it. There were no scenes of cruelty, no dramatic acts of force. There was instead a structure that removed choice so thoroughly that resistance never had a clear target. The system did not require violence. It required compliance reinforced by belief. Later that week, Mary Ellen shared what she had learned with Ruth, carefully, in fragments. Ruth did not react with shock. She reacted with resignation. She said she had suspected something similar for years, that there were moments when timing felt too precise to be coincidence. She said knowing the truth would not change the outcome, only the weight of it. Mary Ellen disagreed silently. Knowing changed everything. Once she saw the quota, she saw it everywhere. She noticed how women were spoken of in terms of readiness, how illness was treated not as concern but as delay, how sermons praised sacrifice only when it aligned with need. She noticed how men spoke of the valley as if it were a closed system, fragile and in need of careful management. Outside influence was discouraged. Independence was framed as dangerous. Mary Ellen understood now why the system depended so heavily on faith. Faith reduced questions. Faith transformed exploitation into duty. The most disturbing realization arrived late one night as she lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her. If there was a quota, then there was an end point. She wondered how close she was to it. She recalled the way older women had been retired from the rotation, not released exactly, but repositioned into lesser roles, given just enough support to survive quietly, removed from the count. She wondered how many children the system required before a woman was considered fulfilled. The question haunted her. Mary Ellen knew that open defiance would bring consequences she could not withstand. The system would not punish her loudly. It would erode her support, isolate her further, and frame her resistance as moral failing. Yet she also knew that compliance would continue until the quota was met. The realization created a tension she had never felt before, a pressure that built not from fear, but from inevitability. She had been chosen because she fit the system's needs, widowed, landless, respected, isolated. The system had not forced her into place. It had guided her there so smoothly, she had mistaken it for mercy. Now that illusion was gone. Mary Ellen did not yet know how to resist. She only knew that understanding had shifted her role. She was no longer merely enduring. She was calculating. And in a system built on predictability, a woman who began to think beyond her assigned place represented something far more dangerous than open rebellion. She represented uncertainty. Mary Ellen understood now that resistance did not begin with refusal. Refusal was visible. It was loud. It invited correction. Real resistance, she learned, was quieter and far more exhausting. She began with small deviations, careful enough to appear accidental. She lingered longer over tasks that once took minutes. She asked for clarification on instructions she already understood. She requested rest when fatigue became undeniable, not as complaint, but as concern for her ability to serve properly. The responses came swiftly, though never harshly. At the Holcomb estate, her workload was adjusted, but closely monitored. At the Barlow farm, meals were altered again, accompanied by reminders about discipline and consistency. At the Lowry place, the preacher visited more frequently, offering guidance that sounded supportive, but carried an edge of evaluation. Nothing she did went unnoticed. Mary Ellen realized the system responded not with punishment, but with recalibration. Any deviation was absorbed, corrected, and returned to alignment. The structure was flexible enough to bend, but never enough to break. She tested another boundary. During a church service, she chose not to bow her head during prayer. It was a small act, easily missed. Yet afterward, a woman she barely knew approached her with concern, asking if she felt unwell. The question was framed as kindness, but it carried a message. Deviation was visible. Mary Ellen spoke less after that, conserving her energy for observation. She noticed how isolation was applied selectively. Women who asked too many questions found themselves seated apart. Their names faded from sermons. Assistants arrived later, thinner, conditional. No one was cast out. They were simply made smaller. Ruth warned her quietly one evening as they crossed paths near the church. She said the system tolerated exhaustion, but not disruption. Mary Ellen nodded. She had already learned that lesson. The cost of resistance revealed itself gradually. Her access to small comforts diminished. Warm blankets were reassigned. Fresh supplies arrived less often. Conversations shortened. The preacher's tone cooled, shifting from praise to concern. Concern, she learned, was the first step toward correction. One afternoon, Mary Ellen was asked to meet with the preacher and 2 estate representatives. The meeting was framed as care. They spoke of her health, her spirit, the importance of maintaining balance. They asked whether she felt overwhelmed. The question was not an invitation. It was an assessment. Mary Ellen answered carefully. She said she remained grateful. She said she wished only to serve well. She did not mention confusion or doubt. The men exchanged glances. One of them remarked that prolonged strain could lead to weakness of judgment. The preacher added that guidance existed to protect women from such burdens. Mary Ellen understood the warning. If she pushed too hard, decisions would be made for her in the name of care. After that meeting, the rotation tightened. Her schedule left less unaccounted time. Overlaps disappeared. The brief moments where paths crossed with other women were eliminated. The system closed ranks. Mary Ellen felt the walls narrowing, not physically, but socially. Support became conditional. Approval became something to earn again. The realization that frightened her most was how effective this was. There were no locks, no raised voices, no visible force. Everything was framed as protection, guidance, and order. Any discomfort she felt could be explained away as fatigue or confusion. She understood now why women before her had not escaped. The system did not trap bodies. It trapped options. Leaving required resources she did not have. Speaking out required credibility the system could strip away. Even memory could be challenged by records written in ink. Mary Ellen thought often of the older women Ruth had mentioned, those quietly removed from the rotation once they no longer met expectations. Their lives had not improved with age. They had simply been reassigned to obscurity. That was the future the system offered her. Endurance until depletion, followed by quiet retirement. Yet even as the pressure mounted, something within Mary Ellen hardened. Understanding had replaced confusion. Fear had sharpened into resolve. She began to document what she could, not on paper, but in memory. Names, dates written out in full, phrases repeated in meetings, shifts in behavior following small acts of resistance. She shared fragments with Ruth and the others when rare moments allowed. Not enough to alarm, but enough to confirm alignment. Each woman carried pieces of the pattern, scattered, but intact. Mary Ellen realized the system's greatest weakness was not secrecy, but assumption. It assumed women would not connect their experiences. That isolation would prevent synthesis. Connection, even minimal, disrupted predictability. The preacher sensed the change, though he could not name it. His visits grew more pointed. He spoke of obedience as protection, of humility as safety. He reminded her that communities did not survive disruption. Mary Ellen listened without reacting. Inside, she measured every word. One evening, after a long day, she stood alone at the edge of a field, watching children work under supervision. She recognized faces, not by name, but by memory. She felt the familiar pull of grief, then something else, clarity. She knew she could not dismantle the system, not alone, not openly. But she also knew that compliance would only extend her usefulness, not her freedom. Resistance without escape meant choosing how much of herself the system would take. She began to comply selectively. She met expectations where refusal would bring swift consequence. She withheld where deviation could be disguised. She learned to appear aligned while preserving what little agency remained. It was not victory. It was survival sharpened by awareness. Mary Ellen understood now that the system did not need her loyalty. It needed her predictability. And predictability, once broken even slightly, introduced risk. She did not know what that risk would become, only that it existed now, growing quietly beneath routines that no longer felt invincible. The system had planned for endurance. It had not planned for awareness. Mary Ellen did not go looking for the ledger room. She knew better than to seek what the system preferred unseen. What brought her there was necessity, framed as duty. The Lowry household prepared for an inspection, not an official one, not the kind that arrived with strangers and questions, but a review conducted by men who already knew what they expected to find. The storage rooms were to be reorganized, records checked, supplies counted. Mary Ellen was assigned the task because she was considered reliable. Reliability, she had learned, was granted to those who appeared compliant. The room sat at the far end of the house, behind a door rarely opened. Inside, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with bound books and stacked papers sorted by size and age. There was no dust, no sign of neglect. Everything here was maintained with care. Mary Ellen worked slowly, taking note of what surrounded her. Church ledgers occupied the upper shelves. Household accounts filled the lower ones. In between sat a narrow section of volumes unlike the rest, smaller, uniform, each bound in the same faded cloth. She recognized the handwriting on the spines. The preacher's. She hesitated before touching them, aware of the risk. But the room was quiet. The house occupied elsewhere. Time, for once, was not measured against her. She pulled one volume free. Inside, entries were arranged by year, written fully, carefully. Names appeared in abbreviated form, often reduced to initials. Dates marked rotations, births, transfers. The language was precise and unemotional. Mary Ellen scanned until she found what she expected. Her initials appeared repeatedly. Beside them were notations that mirrored the planning documents she had seen before, but more detailed. Recovery intervals, compliance assessments, observations written in a hand trained to sound neutral while recording ownership. There were columns labeled continuation and release. Mary Ellen's breath caught as she followed the entries forward. The ledger extended beyond the present. Projections filled future pages, mapped with unsettling confidence. Her availability was assumed, her capacity estimated. The system had planned years ahead, factoring in decline, reassignment, eventual removal from rotation. It was not speculation. It was schedule. She closed the book and reached for another. This ledger listed names she recognized from church gatherings. Ruth's initials appeared. Clara's, Miriam's. Women she had spoken with only briefly, now arranged into a sequence that revealed how long each had been in rotation and how close each was to what the system termed fulfillment. Mary Ellen felt something tighten in her chest. Fulfillment did not mean freedom. It meant depletion. The final section of the ledger contained summaries, not personal reflections, but assessments of efficiency. Notes on which arrangements yielded the most stability, which women required less oversight, which households managed transitions most smoothly. The valley was described as a closed environment, self-sustaining, optimized. Mary Ellen understood then why no one panicked when she asked questions, why resistance was met with recalibration instead of force. Everything here had been tested, refined, improved over time. The system had memory. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hall. Mary Ellen returned the ledger to its place with care, her movements steady despite the urgency rising within her. She selected a different book, one she had already been assigned to sort, and positioned herself where she would be seen if anyone entered. The door opened moments later. An estate manager glanced in, nodded, and moved on. Mary Ellen remained still until she was alone again. What unsettled her most was not what she had read, but what was missing. There were no names attached to decisions, no acknowledgement of responsibility. Everything was written as if the system itself acted, guided by necessity rather than people. She realized then that blame had been designed out of the process. Later that evening, she shared what she could with Ruth, carefully, in fragments. Ruth did not ask to see the ledger. She did not need to. Her expression confirmed what she already knew. They spoke quietly, aware of listening ears. Ruth said she had always suspected records existed somewhere beyond church notes and midwife logs. That too much had operated with too much confidence to rely on memory alone. She said knowing the future had been planned was worse than knowing the past had been recorded. Mary Ellen agreed. For the first time, the scope of the system was clear. It did not simply respond to women's lives. It shaped them. It anticipated their decline and adjusted accordingly. Mary Ellen returned to her room that night with a new understanding. Her usefulness was not measured by effort alone. It was measured against a projection she had never seen until now. She lay awake, replaying the ledger entries in her mind. The dates, the phrases, the assumptions written as certainty. She thought of the children she had glimpsed working fields, unaware of the planning that preceded their existence. She thought of the older women living quietly at the edges of the valley, their service complete, their presence tolerated but no longer valued. The system had not lied to her. It had simply omitted her from the conversation. Mary Ellen understood now why open defiance was impossible. The ledger room held proof that resistance would not disrupt the system. It would only prompt revision. If she refused, someone else would be rotated in. If she broke down, the quota would be adjusted. The system did not depend on her. It depended on continuity. That realization brought a strange calm. She stopped asking how to escape. Escape had never been an option the system allowed. Instead, she began to ask a different question. What happened when the ledger was wrong? Projections assumed compliance. They assumed endurance followed predictable curves. They assumed women would not see themselves as variables. Mary Ellen understood then that the ledger was not invincible. It was a map drawn by people who believed they understood everything they controlled. She did not need to destroy it. She did not need to expose it. She only needed to stop fitting it. As she closed her eyes, exhaustion pressed in, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind remained active, tracing the paths the system had laid out for her, then imagining where those paths might falter. The ledger room had shown her the truth. The truth was that the system feared disruption more than it feared morality. And for the first time since her husband's death, Mary Ellen felt something close to leverage. The notice arrived without ceremony. Mary Ellen found it folded neatly beside her supper plate at the Lowry place, placed there with the same quiet confidence that had defined every decision made about her life. The paper bore the church seal. The date was written out in full. The language was formal, restrained, almost kind. It stated that her period of service had been fulfilled. No gratitude was expressed. No apology offered. The document did not acknowledge what the service had cost her. It simply declared that her obligations had been met, and that she was now free to seek her own arrangements. Free. The word felt unfamiliar in her hands. She read the notice twice, then a third time, searching for conditions hidden between the lines. There were none. The system did not need to disguise its ending. It had already taken what it required. When she informed the households, the response was uniform: relief, tempered with respect. The women thanked her for her years of dedication. The men nodded, already shifting their attention to what came next. No one asked where she would go. That question, Mary Ellen realized, was no longer their concern. Her final rotation ended quietly. There was no gathering, no prayer circle, no sermon marking her departure. The preacher offered a brief blessing and reminded her that she would always have a place in the valley, should she require guidance. Guidance, not return. Mary Ellen packed her belongings into the same trunk she had carried at the beginning. It was lighter now. Fewer clothes, less need. Survival had taught her efficiency. On her last morning, she walked the familiar path past the fields. Children worked under watchful eyes, moving in practiced rhythms. Some were old enough to manage tools. Others carried water or sorted supplies. None looked up as she passed. Mary Ellen recognized several faces, not as strangers, as history. They did not know her name. They did not know the circumstances of their beginnings. They only knew the valley as it had always been presented to them, ordered, self-sufficient, righteous. Mary Ellen did not stop. She did not reach out. She understood now that recognition, if it came, would only complicate lives already shaped by the system. What mattered was not what they knew. It was what the system assumed they never would. She left the valley without announcement. No wagon escorted her. No schedule guided her steps. The road beyond the farms was narrow and uneven, leading toward uncertainty rather than promise. Each step away felt both lighter and heavier than the last. Freedom, she learned quickly, did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. There was no plan waiting for her beyond the valley. No savings, no land. Only the knowledge she carried and the body that had been managed for years without her consent. Yet as the distance grew, something unexpected took shape. Silence, not the enforced silence of compliance, but the absence of monitoring. No one watched her posture. No one evaluated her endurance. No one recalibrated her worth. For the first time in years, Mary Ellen was unmeasured. She found work where she could, small tasks exchanged for food or shelter. She avoided churches at first, wary of sermons that spoke too easily of sacrifice. When she did attend, she listened differently now, hearing not only words, but intent. She noticed how systems repeated themselves in quieter forms elsewhere, how language softened exploitation, how gratitude was demanded instead of earned, how records replaced voices. The valley, she understood, was not unique. It was simply efficient. What haunted her most were the ledgers she could no longer see. She knew they continued without her. That new names would fill the spaces she left behind, that projections would adjust, that the system would persist, not because it was cruel, but because it was convenient. That was its greatest defense. Years passed. Mary Ellen aged into a woman the system would no longer have selected. Her body bore the quiet evidence of endurance, but she was no longer inventory. That distinction mattered more than she had once believed. Sometimes in distant towns she met women whose stories carried familiar shapes, different details, same structure, same careful language, same absence of choice framed as care. When she listened, she did not interrupt. She did not offer solutions she knew did not exist. She shared only what mattered, that they were not imagining it, that what felt personal was often structural, that endurance did not mean consent. Mary Ellen never returned to the valley. She did not need to. The truth of it lived on in the bodies and lives shaped by its planning. It lived in the children who grew into labor without knowing why. It lived in the women who rotated until they no longer could. It lived in records written confidently by people who believed order justified everything. The system believed it had won because it continued. Mary Ellen understood something else. Survival had never been the measure of victory. Awareness was. The ledger had predicted her compliance until depletion. It had not accounted for what happened after release. It had not considered that a woman removed from the count could still observe, still remember, still speak, not loudly, but truthfully. And truth, once carried beyond the place that tried to contain it, had a way of unsettling assumptions far larger than one valley. That is what the system could not record. That is what it could not erase. If this story unsettled you, it should. Stories like this are not just about the past. They echo wherever power hides behind paperwork, faith, or tradition. If you want more stories that expose what history tried to normalize, tap like, so this video reaches others who are ready to see it. And subscribe to the channel, because the next story we uncover is even closer to home than you might expect.